Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual book talk, Reluctant Revolutionary, The Life and Legacy of Pastor Andrew Eliot of Boston, with Dr. John S. Oakes. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archives resides what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, and our digital archive with more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. To learn more about what we do and for news to see forthcoming events, please go and visit our website at congregationallibrary.org. All right, so with that, let me go ahead and invite our speaker to come up. Dr. John S. Oakes is a research fellow of Wycliffe College, Toronto. He is also the author of Conservative Revolutionaries, Transformation and Tradition in the Religious and Political Thought of Charles Chauncey and Jonathan Mayhew, published by Pickwick in 2016. As a Bostonian, John, I think I owe you a debt of thanks, gratitude for writing about all of these great Boston ministers. So thank you for doing that. And people came to see you, not me today. So I'm going to turn off my screen and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kyle, for that warm welcome. And it's a privilege to be here today to speak to you. And I'd like to thank Kyle and the Congregational Library and Archives for making this possible. Kyle has already shown you a copy of my book. I'll show you a copy of it here today. And I'm going to give you a general overview of the book, some of the main points that I make along the way. And there'll be opportunity for questions and discussion at the end of this talk. So let's begin. Just 2 weeks after Pastor Andrew Eliot's death in September 1778, a reader of the Boston Gazette newspaper wrote to complain, and I quote, that so striking, so amiable an example of piety, purity, and charity should pass off the stage of action entirely unnoticed. This was especially troubling, the writer thought, in view of Eliot's, and again I quote, extensive erudition, his fortitude and prudence under peculiar trials, his assiduity in the duties of a Christian minister, the seriousness and effective matter of his public addresses, the fullness, perspicuity, elegance, and purity of his compositions, his pathetic and attractive elocution and command of an audience, his patronage of learning, his sympathy with the distressed and beneficence on every occasion, his love of liberty and his country, his domestic virtues. My own interest in the Boston minister was motivated by less lofty concerns. The book actually grew out of a chapter of my PhD dissertation at Simon Fraser University in the Vancouver area, completed in 2008. It's also, that dissertation yielded 2 other publications, an article published in the September 2015 issue of the New England Quarterly on Essex, Massachusetts minister John Wise, and as Kyle has already mentioned, a comparative study of the religious and political thought of Charles Chauncey and Jonathan Mayhew, two of Eliot's contemporaries in the Boston ministry. Its short title is Conservative Revolutionaries. One of the main reasons I chose to study Eliot in my PhD dissertation in the first place was his active engagement politically as well as pastorally and theologically in the life of his times. He had also received relatively limited attention from earlier scholars in the closely studied field of colonial and revolutionary American religious history. For example, there wasn't a single biography of this major Boston minister and community leader. Yet Eliot was a significant political as well as religious leader in colonial and revolutionary New England. He ministered at Boston's New North or Fifth Church, founded in 1714 as an offshoot of Old North or Second Church, which was a bastion of New England theological orthodoxy. He was there for the whole of his 36-year career as an ordained minister from 1742 to 1780. And Boston, of course, was a very important town. It was a significant center of trade. It was also, like others in New England, a highly religious community by modern standards. Most people attended church, and church-going generally involved 2 Sunday services, morning and afternoon, each of which would have included a sermon of 1 or 2 hours in length. And I'm just going to show you a picture of Boston as it then was. And this is the famous 1722 map of Boston put together by John Bonner. And you can see from that map the extent of the main built area that we're talking about. And Eliot's ministry was centered very much in the area of North Boston, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. Between 1710 and 1760, the overall population of Boston nearly doubled. But except for periodic fluctuations of troops, it was only around 15,000 or 16,000 people through the American Revolution. In modern terms, it may be worth considering that that's roughly the year-round population of Martha's Vineyard. To serve those people, the total number of Congregationalist churches in Boston grew to 11 by 1750. Eliot's New North was one of, if not the largest and most prominent. According to his own estimate, about 1760, there were no fewer than 300 families, or bearing in mind the average size of families in those days, some 1,800 people attached to the church. So this was a major congregation, and by virtue of that alone, Eliot was a significant town leader. We sometimes forget that Congregationalist churches enjoyed effectively established status in 18th century Massachusetts and were generally supported by colonial taxes. But in the Boston congregations, there was a lot there were a lot more resources. Those churches were more prosperous than most and could fund their ministers by members' offerings and pew rents, which of course were a significant factor in that day and age. Eliot, in particular, and this is one of the points I make in the book, where a whole chapter is devoted in part to his financial situation, he was able to live the life of the gentleman for which he was educated at Harvard, and he could comfortably provide for a family of 13. Eliot and his wife had 11 children altogether, and it was an unusual family in that all of those sons and daughters grew to adulthood and went on to have significant careers of their own. And if it's have another look at a picture here, this is a view of part of the town of Boston by Paul Revere, done in 1768. And if you look at it, you also see the presence of British ships in the harbor as tensions were building up, culminating, of course, in the Revolution. As a Congregationalist minister, Eliot subscribed to a fiercely independent system of church government in which decision-making power primarily rested with local congregationals. Those of you attached to the Congregationalist library probably don't need to hear this explanation from me. But theologically, 18th century Congregationalists were the heirs of 17th century Puritan forebears, and their standard of orthodoxy remained the Calvinism of the Westminster Confession, although not all adhered to it. Sermons were the main means of mass communication in New England, and the ministers who delivered them were major community leaders. This was especially true of someone like Eliot. In his pioneering magnum opus, The New England Soul, from 1986, Harry Stout has estimated that the average churchgoer was exposed to some 15,000 hours of concentrated sermon listening over the course of a lifetime. I don't think you could probably say that anywhere today. A more likely comparison might be the amount of time people spend on screens. What ministers said and thought on social and political, as well as religious matters, was significant then. As prominent pastors and members of the educated elite, they could also exert major influence in practical ways through their social network. Historians have sometimes linked Eliot with major shifts in New England theology, from traditional Calvinism to Arminianism and beyond, even to universalism and Unitarianism. Scholars have also viewed Eliot as an influential preacher whose works helped shape revolutionary ideology. At this point, it may be helpful for some of us to look at a few key definitions here. Basically, Calvinism centers on the beliefs that God controls everything and is entirely responsible for human salvation. Arminianism favors a more cooperative understanding in which women and men work with God for salvation. Universalism is a simple belief that all will be saved, come what may, and Unitarianism denies a Trinitarian view of God as three in one and one in three, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. As one of my books best qualified reviewers has noted, Eliot was too cautious in his politics and too moderate in his theology to draw historians' interest. That's from Mark Knoll, with just a few exceptions prior to my biography. Another has described him as an enigma. So one of my main goals in this book is to attempt to clarify his views, and I drew added motivation from the fact that I was not convinced by some of the major conclusions of previous studies of Eliot. I also wanted to offer a picture of his daily life and ministry, I think, because we sometimes forget just how different the culture in that time and place was. Now, there was a significant body of source material to draw upon, which had not been fully analyzed, partly because it consists of more than 40 years of line item diaries, which record basic details of everyday church ministry, not much else. By annotating and compiling this data in detail, then I was able to pull together quite a full picture of his ministry and finances, as well as to fill out the portrayals of his theology, political views, and family life, which emerge from his letters and sermons, of which quite a few have been published. So just to give you an idea of the kind of material that we're looking at here, I'm going to share a couple of pages from his these diaries. This gives you an idea of the kind of thing that we're talking about. What Eliot did was to keep records in what we now call, I think, farmers' almanacs. And you can see all the material in the almanac on the right-hand side of this page. On the left, you see Eliot's notes, including some abbreviations. So he not only recorded his own activities, but he recorded others' activities. So, for example, on this page, we've got next to the 11th of January, Mr. Mather TL. TL stands in this case for Thursday lecture, which was a major town event. And then on the 12th, Mr. Adams EL, an evening lecture with a more sacramental focus. So this is the kind of information that we get from these diary almanacs. And you'll see on the 14th, preached AM and PM and administered sacrament. That's what he did at his own church on those days. And then on the next page here, you'll see the kind of accounting details that he included in these booklets. And there are a lot of these accounts, money paid in this case, who he paid and for what. He also gives accounts of his income and in a couple of very valuable places, which I note in the book, of his assets. So these resources in his diary almanacs seem unpromising at first, but in fact they yield a wealth of activity. Over the years, the availability of source materials has changed dramatically because of the internet. When I first began studying Boston Congregationalists in the mid-2000s, I could only read what they had written by going to a university library and taking notes from microform and microfiche materials. Pretty much everything needed is now available online, and I was able to obtain copies of his diaries from microfiche and a few key libraries. So if you look at the resources available at the Congregational Library or at the Massachusetts Historical Society, for example. It's amazing how much you can find online these days. The main scholarly contributions of the book, in my judgment, are, first of all, it's the first full biography of Eliot. Second, it clarifies his theology as moderately and orthodoxly Calvinist, rather than displaying tendencies towards Arminian or Unitarian ideas. That's not to say he didn't consider these ideas. In one place amongst the diaries, I found a fascinating collection of notes that he made about the divinity of Christ. And he was effectively, I think, using those notes to clarify his own position, which ended up being classically Trinitarian. Thirdly, the book demonstrates traditional elements in Eliot's theology, centering on strong commitments to biblical authority, to conventional preaching themes, to vigorous congregationalism, and to fierce anti-Catholicism. I might mention in that also fiercely anti-episcopal, especially given the possible threat of an Anglican bishop being introduced into the colonies. Eliot's son, Ephraim, who wrote a brief history of New North in 1822, offered a fair description, I think, of his father's theology as follows, and I quote, "The creed commonly called the Apostles he assented to. About the time of its settlement, it was supposed by some that he favored the doctrine of the New Lights," that's those who strongly supported the Great Awakening, "but they would not acknowledge him. If he was so inclined, he fully got over it and was a warm opposer of James Davenport, William Hobby, and other itinerant ministers. He thought Whitefield," that's George Whitefield, "a good man, and attended his preaching, especially on his last visit. But he disliked him as being an enthusiast and was fearful that he would do injury by diverting people from their business several times in a day to attend upon his lectures. In the pulpit, he was a favorite. His discourses were plain and practical, seldom on controversial points." In fact, end quotes. I would say that was a quite deliberate policy on his part. He wanted to stick to what he saw as the essentials of the Christian faith and not to get caught up in other issues that might be more contentious. The book also demonstrates the steps that Eliot took to make New North more open and accessible, especially to newcomers and outsiders. For example, when he started there was a requirement that anyone who wanted to become a member should give a full oral testimony of how they came to faith in Christ. Later on in his ministry, that was changed to a written statement. A written statement was considered sufficient. He changed the singing, the psalm singing, by introducing a new system which other churches were doing. The music life of the church grew, and Eliot dealt with, of course, a slave-owning congregation. Some of his members would have owned slaves themselves, but he was quite progressive in his approach towards ministering to slaves who were in the congregation. So this book also explores Eliot's more progressive views on slavery, but less progressive on First Nations issues. Eliot was a strong believer in the civilization, in quotation marks, as well as the proselytization of First Nations peoples. The book details Eliot's struggles with embracing the revolutionary cause, given his strong commitments to Protestant British ideals. That's a major theme because he was strongly attached to Britain, as were many of his contemporaries, not least for their Protestant ideals. And it was only over time that that position changed. The book shows how Eliot's more radical Whig political ideas were tempered by such concerns, but it also demonstrates that Eliot fully embraced independence once armed hostilities were underway. This project overall took me about more than 9 years to complete. The bulk of the research and writing was done alongside my pastoral ministry in the Anglican Church of Canada, the Episcopal Church, and a Vancouver Baptist Church. As an academic book, it has not made the New York Times bestseller list, but it hopefully contributes to the advance of historical knowledge. Writing a book like this requires a lot of help as well as hard work, and I am most grateful to the many who have supported me in my academic endeavors over the years. The main achievement of Reluctant Revolutionary, such as it is, lies in offering a fresh portrait of Eliot as a moderate but orthodox Calvinist who maintained a consistent witness at a time of theological turmoil. A prosperous family man who helped lay the foundations for future generations of Eliots among the Boston Brahmin. A reluctant revolutionary whose devotion to the Protestant ideals prevented him from embracing the patriot cause until hostilities were already underway. A dedicated pastor who worked extremely hard and whose records facilitate a detailed picture of how he handled his everyday responsibilities. A committed Harvard alumnus who offered years of service in leadership of the institution, but who was so devoted to his pastoral vocation that he turned down the presidency of the college on more than one occasion. He was one of the few, very few, Boston ministers to choose to endure the hardships of Boston under British military occupation in 1775 to 1776, risking life and limb in the process, not least by spending so much time ministering to the sick and wounded. And he was a gifted communicator who was renowned for his energetic and rhetorically plain-speaking abilities in the pulpit, but also left some powerful correspondence, especially from the revolutionary period. One of the most striking passages in his correspondence comes from Eliot's letter to his son John from besieged Boston on April the 28th, 1775, just days after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And I quote, "Poor Boston, may God sanctify our distresses, which are greater than you conceive. Such a Sabbath of melancholy and darkness I never knew. Most of the meeting houses shut up, the ministers gone, our congregation crowded with strangers. A town meeting in the forenoon agreed to give up their arms in order to get leave to depart. A provincial army in Rochester, Dorchester, and Cambridge. College dispersed, this town a garrison, every face gathering paleness, all hurry and confusion, one going this way and another that, others not knowing where to go. What to do with our poor maid, I cannot tell. In short, after the melancholy exercises of the day, I am unable to write anything with propriety or connection. So Eliot was a complex and fascinating man, and I've tried to convey some of his complexities. I could say a lot more about this book, but I also want to leave time for questions. And so thank you for your attention. I'm going to hand it back to Kyle now to take it forward.
Thank you so much, John. That was such a great overview, and you've given us, you planted so many seeds here for questions and things to dig into. So you've got Eliot here in Boston, in New North, in a that he served for many years, a strong connection to Harvard. I'm imagining a pretty active association of fellow congregational ministers. I guess maybe, I think one of the great questions as we're trying to reconstruct the intellectual lives of people in the past is understanding kind of where they get their ideas from. And, does Eliot reveal that? Is it through reading? Is it through conversation? Is it through direct observation? Where do you kind of come down on how he learns and how he engages with the ideas around him?
Well, I think the starting place is inevitably Harvard, and I devote some pages in the book to describing the kind of education that he would have received there. One interesting part of that, of course, is that they were expected to be able to converse and to be taught in Latin. It was run very much along the lines of a medieval or post-medieval British university, except for the theology, which was staunchly Puritan. So you start with his education there, and Eliot was fortunate enough to get scholarships so that he could stay around to do his master's degree at Harvard as well. And so he spent pretty much all his life in Boston. There was an active ministerial association of which Eliot served as secretary for a number of years, and we can have the minutes of their meetings. Of course, by modern standards, Boston was a small town, and the ministers all knew each other and all spent quite a bit of time together. And so there would have been a lot of discussion amongst those who disagreed with each other as well as those who are on the same side. Eliot was also a keen reader. If you look at one or two of his lectures, for example, he quotes the sources of the reading that he's done to give a lecture on natural revelation, for example, which is one of his key works. He was actively engaged throughout his ministry in the intellectual life of his times.
Well, thank you. And great to know where to kind of jump in the book too, to start to kind of think about those kind of influences. Go over to one of the questions in our Q&A from John Putnam, who writes, how does Eliot's Calvinistic beliefs lead him to become a reluctant revolutionary? So think a little bit about your title there. What's the connection between Calvinism and reluctance?
Yeah, that's a very good question, which we could take in a lot of different directions. I took the phrase reluctant revolutionary from an article by Bernard Bailyn, a prominent Harvard historian, where his focus was more temperamental as far as the reluctance was concerned. I interpreted the reluctance in terms of his caution, yes, temperamental caution, but also his desire to stay on good terms with loyalists as well as patriots. He was a good friend of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, for example, and helped him with his history of Massachusetts. He was not always universally praised for standing in the middle. In a Boston minister's ballad from the early 1770s, his nickname is Andrew Sly, which is an interesting one. As far as his Calvinism is concerned, he was very much a providential. He had a very much a providential view of the world, and so he would have seen everything that unfurled as God, as the playing out of God's will, uh, whether active or permissive, and including his own life, which he talks about quite a lot. His letters are quite revealing of him as a person, and I would definitely encourage people to look at the section on his letters during the siege of Boston, which are really quite powerful. I read a quote from his diary, one of his diaries on that, but to his family, there are some wonderful letters. But he would have seen whatever happened as an outworking of God's plan.
I want to kind of jump in with a question, then I want to go to the next one, which is, do you see questioning in him? I think one of the things that we think a lot about here in our online and our in-person exhibition is just how long this war went on for. And on the
Mm-hmm.
one hand, Boston's occupation is the earliest occupation. By 1775, the forces are starting to head out to New York and the mid-Atlantic. But it's not a war that gets won quickly. And do you get a sense of how somebody like Eliot, who is standing in that pulpit week after week, having a large and often influential congregation, and actually maybe even a congregation of refugees for part of that time, looking up at him. I mean, do you get a sense of him ever wrestling with this, or is there kind of a, and I know he only lives to 1778, but I guess, it's a question about that, about how he handles something that is just seemingly ongoing.
Yes, definitely. Well, I think we can learn from his letters that he actually kind of saw the revolution as inevitable, that he, and there's even evidence that he thought that a split from Britain was bound to come. Such were the differences between the two sides. Because he only lived to 1778, we don't get a lot on his differing views during that time period. What we do know, though, is that as one of only three ministers who stayed during the Boston siege, he was ministering to those who were left behind. A lot of people fled the city, and he definitely had two minds about whether he should have done that, given how much he suffered. He clearly hates war and speaks quite forthrightly against that, also in his diary notes. And I think, yes, I mean, we do see the only times that we really see him openly advocate on the patriot side of things by the time that George Washington is already in town. And of course, as one of the town leaders, he's part of the greeting Washington and entertaining him at Harvard and so on. And in his letters to his son, Andrew, and all his sons, but Andrew and John primarily, he talks quite forcefully about the patriot cause at that point. Yeah.
Where you're starting to take us in the direction of a great question from Christopher Walton, who is one of our former research fellows here, who's doing a fantastic dissertation on revolutionary life in the kind of Connecticut River Valley,
Oh,
doing
right.
really important work. And Christopher writes, I believe I remember that Eliot was one of the few who does not leave Boston during the British
That's
occupation.
right.
Maybe could you speak to how he's approaching his pastoral ministry in Boston during these revolutionary years? Do we have evidence of how is he changing things, or is he?
Well, of course, his congregation shrank considerably and his ministry changed a lot. I covered this in the book because he had, prior to the hostilities, he had this system in place of pulpit exchanges and so on, which meant that he didn't have to come up with a new sermon every Sunday. That was one of the consequences of that. His sermons could be shared with different congregations, and we have evidence that he did that. Although it's sometimes considered a no-no even today to do that. Yes, he spent a lot of time ministering to the sick, and that was one of his main focuses. He carried on services. He and another minister even tried to carry on the Boston Thursday lecture, which was a prominent weekly occurrence. But they reached the point where they realized that because they were having to alternate between them, that they reached the point where they decided this was no longer possible. And Eliot's note on that shows that he was very disappointed by this, that had that great tradition, which had been going for more than 100 years, had to stop temporarily, because we also find him mentioning its return later on. So, yes, his ministry would have been very pastorally focused, as well as his ongoing church duties, preaching, and so on. He'd have been very busy. And he also complains about scarcity of food and so on, which was a real issue. And he clearly wants to leave at times. And you find this in one of his letters to his son. He wants to leave, but he's embarrassed that he wants to leave because he sees it as his duty, which I found a fascinating insight into his character.
If I can ask the question, you mentioned your own situatedness, right? Where you're at as you're writing this book, pastor, various congregations, doing that full time while writing a book, which is no small feat in itself.
Well, part-time now, because I'm retirement age. Yeah.
Right. You don't look old enough to retire. But so are there ways, though, that this book is influenced by your own kind of work as a minister, your own experiences? Does that bring you, and do you find any sort of resonances with Eliot? I mean, you're not living through a war, of course, but do you ever find that might have helped you kind of understand him?
I think it, in some ways, yes. But one of the main things that struck me was the differences. I mean, first off, Eliot was one of the leading citizens of the town. Now, there are a few ministers who have that position in different towns, perhaps bishops or prominent pastors, but most of us don't. Our lives are much more obscure. In terms of what he was expected to do, a lot of that remains similar, of course, pastoral care and so on. But I have to say, I'm glad that I'm not expected to preach for more than an hour every Sunday. I think my congregation is probably glad too. His ability to pray extempore for up to an hour really struck me. But also the fact that, he's dealing with life as it comes, and that happens to all of us. The issues of our day may be different. They are very different, but there's never a time where there aren't issues of contention. And often the question is, how do we respond? And I've tended to try to stay on good terms with as many as possible, as Eliot did. But it's not an easy road to travel. And in that sense, I think Eliot can speak to today's situation for some in my kind of position. The other thing that struck me was that Eliot hardly ever seems to have taken a holiday. There's evidence of him traveling in June and September when the weather would have been somewhat better, I think. But even when he traveled for a week or so, he would preach at other churches. So he was hardworking, and in that sense, I don't think that the many modern day pastors would be comfortable with his work schedule.
Well, we know you're hardworking, but I hope you take vacations. We've got a great final question here from Christopher Fritsch, who writes, when his congregation grew smaller, was that due to patriots moving out of town or loyalists who were embarking? And then a follow-up to that is, do we know kind of what his 13 children did during the conflict? Were they all of a similar political mind as his, or was it a fractured family, as we sometimes see?
I don't know their political positions, but they certainly, judging from his correspondence with his son Andrew, who became pastor at Fairfield, Connecticut, they're very much on the same page. His sons and daughters all went on to enjoy quite prominent positions in society. Another way in which Eliot's life is different from, or was different from, a lot of modern day pastors is that he seems to have built some wealth over the course of his ministry, and part of that was ministering in the congregation that he did, where there were a lot of wealthy members who gave him gifts. As far as the congregation shrinking, yes, that would have been people getting out of town to escape the British occupation. There were loyalists who remained, but there was one loyalist minister who stayed behind, and he looked after most of them. But I think, I haven't seen numbers, but clearly once that siege was over, they would have returned, and the church prospered. Interesting enough, his son John took over the church, and he was one who drifted in a more liberal direction subsequently. And despite, a new building in the early 1800s, within 100 years of Eliot's ministry, the neighborhood had changed to such an extent that the church ceased to be. And I consider that in my final chapter on Eliot's legacy. So I can't say whether all his family were on the same page, but Eliot definitely had a strong influence on all of his kids. John was one of the founders of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Ephraim was a prominent pharmacist, and Andrew, a minister of Fairfield, Connecticut. So there's a lot in this book for those who want to look at all the details.
John, thank you so much for giving us your time this afternoon and giving us this book. On behalf of all of our virtual audience, please know how much we appreciate your work.
No, I thank you very much for this opportunity. It's great to be able to do so, and maybe I can look into one of those research fellowships for another stage when I go on to my next project.
Please do. You and everyone in our virtual audience is welcome to come and research here at the Congregational Library.
Well, certainly I look forward to returning to Boston, because I've learned more about it than I probably do about my home city.
Well, as an unabashed Boston booster, you've seen the light. So, all right, take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.